Now let's just take a moment and take a step back, and let's take a look at what we really are facing at the moment. What are the challenges that we're facing? Well, I think primarily three things. And the first thing is, biological threat and financial threat. The biological threat is obvious, and what of course makes it difficult to deal with is that it's a threat that we know is there, but we can't see it. So we're taking all these precautions, and we're also dealing with something. It's different than if you're, out there, on the African savannah and you see a lion in the distance. Well, we don't know where the lion is here. And second is financial threat. Many people are affected now by the fact that the lockdown and all the steps that have been taken now to deal with it have had a profound impact on the world economy. And in some countries, unemployment is through the roof. And interestingly, depending on, which of these threats is more salient for you, which are the ones that are affecting you more, may depend on, where you are, what country you come from, what your family's personal circumstances are. In the United States, there are surveys that show that actually right now, more people report being very worried about their financial threats than the fear of getting the virus. Actually, more than 50% of people in the United States are saying that they are very concerned about financial worries, whereas about a third of them say they're very concerned about getting infected. Now, that could be because the social safety net in the United States is not as strong as it is in some other countries, like in Europe. In many European countries, we're fortunate to have all kinds of financial safety nets in place that can at least help us in the short run. But of course, also, you see now that governments are trying to weigh these things, the bylaw, when should we end the quarantine and how can we get the economy started? So these are two major threats that we're simultaneously facing. Another thing that we're dealing with is loss. And when I say loss, now, in some of the most unfortunate cases, people who've actually lost loved ones, that's of course a terrible thing. But for many of us, most of us who, fortunately have not, we're still talking about the loss of our freedoms. We're talking about the loss of daily activities, daily pleasures. And, again, how that affects you depends on what your circumstances are. It can also depend on your age. Like if you're a younger person, you may just, want to be able to go, and a lot of your downtime may involve just going and hanging out with your friends and, going into the city and, doing fun things. And if you're a guy like me, well, actually, I don't really do anything fun, so I didn't really lose that much. No, actually, that's not true. But in any case, we're all dealing with different kinds of losses, and some of those losses may also have to do with, people being worried about losing their dreams. If your dream is to go to graduate school, or if your dream is to travel somewhere, and these are things that you've been looking forward to, you may be worried about those losses as well. And then the third is confinement, being stuck in small spaces. So that affects us a lot, looking at the same walls 24/7, the lack of stimulation, the lack of freedom again. So these are all challenges that we're facing. And what does that result in? It results in stress, which I'll call corona stress. Now, our brains and our biology have a particular kind of response to stress, particularly chronic stress. And I want to differentiate between acute and chronic stress. Acute stress is an immediate danger. Think about that lion on the African savannah. And that our brains and our bodies have evolved these mechanisms to deal with acute stress. And our brains and our bodies have something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is part of our threat response system. And it prepares us to fight, flight, or freeze, something that I'm sure you've heard about that. And that system works really well when we're under acute threat. Works really, really well. How do we know it works well? Because we as a species have survived, right? So this is proof that this system works well. But the system does not work very well under situations of chronic stress. In chronic stress, our brains keep pumping out these stress hormones like cortisol, and this can have a longer-term detrimental effect on our health and in terms of also our psychological well-being. And in terms of chronic stress, there are a whole variety of common symptoms that you might be familiar with. Feeling more, getting more irritable, getting into fights with people more easily, feeling fatigued, getting tired easily, having trouble concentrating, sleeping problems, changes in appetite or digestion, feeling helpless, feeling a loss of control, which I think a lot of people feel, feeling low self-esteem, feeling like I'm not coping with this situation as well as other people. Why am I getting depressed and I see other people seem just fine? Sometimes a loss of sexual interest, and also just general nervousness and tension. So you may recognize some of these symptoms. If you recognize them, you just remember you are not alone. Many of us are dealing with these kinds of symptoms to some degree or another. Now, where there's stress, there is coping. Okay, we all consciously or deliberately or unconsciously find different ways of coping when we are dealing with conditions of stress. So what I'd like to do is talk about 3 different kinds of coping. And the first kind of coping, which is illustrated in this side, is what's called in the coping literature, task-oriented coping. That means I am going to cope by doing something. Well, it turns out when you look at the research on stress and coping that actually task-oriented coping in general is one of the most successful ways of coping in terms of reducing our stress. So that's interesting to know. However, as is the case for all forms of coping, it also depends on how extreme those forms of coping are. And here on the left, I've got the situation under control. You have somebody who's obsessively cleaning, something that some of you might experience during Corona times. I have to admit, that's me. And the second one on the right, the antenna up, that means hypervigilance, looking around for threats. When is the next threat coming? Where is it coming from? And that you may notice if you are obsessively, let's say, looking at the news to try to find out, what's the latest information about Corona. Now, many of us do that. And if you think about it, staying clean and being alert for threats, well, that's a very reasonable thing to do when there's a pandemic, right? Our bodies are naturally, and our brains are kicking in. This is part of our threat response system. So it makes sense. The problem is that sometimes these active task-oriented attempts to cope go on overdrive. And when they go on overdrive, they can overwhelm us with information. For example, when we're obsessively seeking out information. And so one of the things that I've learned, and I also remember this from years ago when I was living in New York City during the time of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, at a certain point, you gotta limit your information. So one way to do that is just to say, I'm going to give myself, half hour a day or 15 minutes a day at a certain time of the day, and that's when I'm going to get my news. And that's it. Or some people just say, hey, I'm not really going to look at the news at all, and if there's something really important, I'm sure I'll find out about it. Okay, so the point here is that even though in general task-oriented coping is the preferable approach, that anything can go too far. So we're trying to look for solutions that are more moderated, more modulated. Well, okay. Here's another kind of coping. It has to do with avoidance, avoidant coping. That is avoiding stressful situations. And here you see 3 examples of avoidant coping. One is using substances or using other addictive behavior. Now you might say, why is that avoidant? Well, it's avoidant because I'm using, let's say, alcohol or drugs or whatever it would be to numb my emotions, right? So when I'm using these substances or whatever it would be and whatever I'm doing, then at that point, my feelings are numb. I'm kind of escaping from my feelings. And so it has, in a way, you could say a beneficial short-term effect. In the long run, of course, it doesn't really change anything. And sometimes it can really lead to feelings afterward of, a lot of shame or regret or whatever it might be. So again, anything in moderation. And I guess here part of the question is if you see you have already addictive tendencies, that's something obviously you want to keep an eye on more. But I have to admit, that I have a little thing for an Aperol spritz around 5 o'clock. And, when the weather's nice, if I just drink one, that's okay. I was going to put the recipe for Aperol spritz on this slideshow, but I just thought it was a bad example for our young people. The slide in the middle with the motorcycle, this is basically risk-taking behavior. And some people might at a certain point be going stir crazy from all of this stuff that is going on, staying inside. And they may just say, screw it. I'm going to go and hang out at the beach. I'm going to go hang out with my friends. And it's essentially avoidance, because it's avoiding all those bad feelings we're having by distracting ourselves, by seeking thrills or kicks. And so, what I would say is, if you're seeking thrills or kicks, just be aware of the fact that that can have a dangerous side, right? You may be putting yourself at risk or putting other people at risk. And then finally on the right with that wall, that's basically, I'm just going to block out my feelings. Now, avoidance, again, to a moderate degree, to a flexible degree, has a place. And the question is the avoidance that you're putting into place something that you're doing with conscious, deliberate choice? Are you coming from a healthy place in the way that you're avoiding? Or is it a kind of automatic thing that just takes over and then ends up putting you or other people at risk? A third kind of coping is what's called emotion-focused coping. So coping on with emotions, coping by focusing on our emotions. Now, sometimes you can imagine that this would involve things like worrying too much, ruminating, just feeling flooded with all kinds of negative feelings. And yet, interestingly, again, sharing, some degree of being in touch with our emotions can actually be helpful in these circumstances. If we're just blocking out our emotions, we may still be experiencing a lot of stress. And in that case, getting in touch with our feelings and sharing it with people in a constructive way can really help. So again, in terms of, emotion-focused coping, you may have noticed yourself getting more irritable or more, angry at people, feeling lonely or lost, or feeling a sense of loss or grief, or maybe just kind of giving up and just kind of letting your life go and not doing the things you need to do and sitting on the couch and eating chips. So these are all examples of just kind of feeling overwhelmed with emotion and kind of giving into that in a certain kind of a way. So one thing I would like to say about this before I go on is this, that all of us are having, I think, better days and worse days. I have better days and worse days. And that's very challenging. And maybe you're finding you have more worse days than you normally would. You're not alone in this. Now, what I would also say is that I think some people may be suffering in these cases more than others. And if you are really experiencing a lot of feelings of loss or grief, or you're finding you're having trouble controlling your anger, this is a good time to reach out to somebody. I've noticed that the student counseling centers at the university don't seem to be getting more calls, at least from what I've been hearing, than they normally do. And maybe that's because, the students out there are doing just fine. They're still busy with their schoolwork, and maybe they're handling things fine. But for people who are struggling right now, I'm really saying to you, this is not the time to be stoical. This is not the time to feel like I should be able to handle it. If something's really bothering you, please just reach out to somebody, reach out to a friend or a family member, or call the student counseling center, or find another professional. Find somebody to talk to about what's going on with you. You don't have to be alone in it.